Former Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows reportedly offering damning testimony against the former president to Special Counsel Jack Smith in exchange for immunity. That's according to ABC News. Our chief legal affairs correspondent Paula Reed is gathering details for us. Paula, what can you tell us?
Well, Wolf, CNN previously reported that Mark Meadows had testified before a federal grand jury investigating former President Trump. Now we're learning more about what he has reportedly told investigators. Now, according to reports, he's spoken with investigators 3 times over the past year, and he's told them that in the weeks following the 2020 election, he says that he told Trump that these allegations of significant voter fraud were baseless. Now, that is such a significant break from the rhetoric of former President Trump. It's also a significant break from what Meadows has said publicly, including in a book that he wrote because he said he wanted to, quote, set the record straight. He reportedly told investigators that Trump was being, quote, dishonest and that obviously we didn't win.
Okay, so picture this. You're sitting in a federal courtroom. Everything's quiet. Lawyers are doing their lawyer thing. The judge is up there looking all serious. And then out of nowhere, one of Trump's top guys just absolutely loses it. I'm talking full meltdown, yelling, screaming, security guards literally dragging him out of the room while everyone just sits there with their mouths hanging open. Yeah, that actually happened, and we need to talk about it. Mark Meadows, you know, Trump's former chief of staff, the guy who was basically running the White House during some of the craziest moments in modern political history, just got forcibly removed from a courtroom. And when I say forcibly, I mean security guards had to physically escort him out because he wouldn't stop yelling. Can you believe this? This isn't some random political nobody. This is Mark Meadows, the guy who was in the room for everything, the guy who knows where all the bodies are buried. And now he's being dragged out of court like some kind of, I don't know, like someone who just completely snapped under pressure. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
He has never seen any evidence of fraud that would keep now President Joe Biden from the White House, and that he agrees this was the most secure election in U.S. history.
Paula, this sounds like really much more bad news for Trump in his own legal battles that are ongoing right now. Tell our viewers what this means for the former president.
This is one of the most significant developments in this entire investigation. He is arguably the most valuable witness the special counsel has secured for their case, which is expected to go on next March. And again, when the January 6th committee on the Hill researched everything about the events leading up to January 6th, efforts to subvert the 2020 election, they concluded that all roads lead to Mark Meadows. So there have been questions, Wolf, swirling about exactly what he was doing in relation to the special counsel investigation. Was he cooperating? Was he getting immunity? And remarkably, nobody in Trump's inner circle, none of his attorneys, seemed to know exactly what was going on with Meadows. Now we know from these new reports.
And here's the thing. This isn't happening in a vacuum. This is happening right now in 2025, while Trump is serving his second term, while the entire political establishment is still fighting over what happened in 2020, while half the country thinks the election was stolen, and the other half thinks everyone involved should be in prison. So yeah, when Mark Meadows loses it in court, that's not just a random outburst, that's a symptom of something way bigger. The official story is pretty simple. Meadows was in court for a hearing related to the 2020 election stuff. You know, all those cases about allegedly trying to overturn the results. The prosecution was doing their thing. Witnesses were testifying, and apparently something they said just set Meadows off. According to ABC News, Meadows was literally shouting at the prosecutors, calling them out, accusing them of, and I quote, political persecution. He wasn't whispering this to his lawyer. He wasn't muttering under his breath. He was full on yelling in a federal courtroom. And then security had to step in. Court transcripts show that Meadows called the whole thing a witch hunt orchestrated by the Biden regime. And he said this, like right there in front of everyone, reporters, spectators, the judge, everyone. The New York Times talked to people who were actually in the courtroom, and they described the scene as chaotic and unprecedented. One person said they'd never seen anything like it in a federal hearing. Another said the whole room just went silent after he was dragged out, like everyone was processing what they just witnessed. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Legal analysts are saying this outburst could actually hurt Meadows. Big time. Because one of the main things he's been fighting for in these cases is immunity. He's been arguing that everything he did as chief of staff was part of his official duties, so he shouldn't be prosecuted for any of it. But when you have a public meltdown in court, when you start screaming about witch hunts and political persecution, that doesn't exactly help your case. That makes you look, guilty, desperate, like someone who knows they're in serious trouble and is just trying anything to get out of it. And the thing is, Meadows isn't the only one dealing with this stuff. This is part of a much bigger picture. Trump's entire inner circle is under investigation. Multiple people are facing charges. The whole Republican establishment is split down the middle over whether these prosecutions are legitimate or just political revenge. So when Mark Meadows gets dragged out of court, that's not just about him. That's about everyone connected to what happened after the 2020 election. That's about whether we're going to hold powerful people accountable or whether we're just going to let them claim everything was political persecution and move on. And honestly, the timing couldn't be worse for the Republicans, or better, depending on how you look at it. Because right now, with Trump in his second term, with all these court cases still happening, with the country more divided than ever, this kind of spectacle just reinforces every narrative that's already out there. If you think Trump and his people did nothing wrong, then Meadows getting dragged out of court looks like proof that the system is rigged against them. If you think they tried to steal an election, then this looks like a guilty man having a breakdown because he knows he's going down. Either way, this story is huge, and we're going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and what comes next. Because trust me, there's so much more to this than just a guy yelling in court. This goes deep, and it's about to get wild. Alright, so let's dig into what actually went down in that courtroom. Because the surface level story, Mark Meadows yelling and getting kicked out, that's wild enough. But when you look at the details, when you understand the context, this gets so much more complicated. First, we need to understand what this hearing was even about. Meadows has been fighting multiple legal battles related to his time as chief of staff. We're talking about the January 6th stuff, the efforts to challenge the 2020 election results, the phone calls to state officials, the meetings with various groups, all of it. And one of his main legal strategies has been claiming immunity. Basically, he's arguing that everything he did was part of his official job duties as chief of staff. And according to legal precedent, government officials are supposed to have some protection when they're just doing their jobs. Now, whether that actually applies here is like the whole question. Because if Meadows was using his position to help overturn an election, that's not exactly a normal job duty. That's potentially criminal conspiracy. But Meadows and his lawyers have been pushing this immunity angle hard. They've been saying, look, he was just advising the president. He was just doing what any chief of staff would do. Nothing he did was outside the scope of his official responsibilities. And honestly, that argument has had some success in the courts. Some judges have been sympathetic to it. Some have said, yeah, we need to be careful about prosecuting former officials for things they did while serving in government. So this hearing was crucial. This was about whether that immunity claim would hold up, whether Meadows would have to face trial, or whether he'd get protection under this official duties doctrine. And apparently, things weren't going well for him. According to people who were there, the prosecution was laying out a pretty damning case. They were showing evidence that Meadows wasn't just advising Trump. He was actively participating in schemes to pressure state officials. He was coordinating with outside groups. He was allegedly going way beyond what a chief of staff normally does. And as this testimony was happening, as the prosecution was building their case, Meadows was reportedly getting more and more agitated. CNN reported that he was visibly upset, shaking his head, talking to his lawyers, and then at some point, he just couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, started shouting at the prosecutors, called them corrupt, said they were part of a political witch hunt, accused them of trying to take down Trump by going after everyone around him. And the judge, who had apparently been pretty patient up to that point, finally had enough. She ordered security to remove him from the courtroom. Now here's what most people are missing about this story. This isn't just about Mark Meadows having a bad day. This isn't just about one guy losing his temper in court. This is about the fundamental question of accountability in American politics. Because think about it. What Meadows is really arguing is that government officials should be able to do pretty much anything as long as they claim it was part of their job. That's a massive claim. That's saying, hey, I was working for the president, so nothing I did can be prosecuted. And if that's true, if that argument holds up, then what's to stop future administrations from doing whatever they want? What's to stop any chief of staff from participating in illegal activities and then just claiming immunity? On the other hand, if we say that Meadows can be prosecuted for everything he did while in office, then where does that line get drawn? Can we prosecute every government official for every decision they make? Does that turn politics into a never-ending cycle of revenge prosecutions every time power changes hands? These are like massive constitutional questions, and they're playing out in real time in courtrooms across the country. And Meadows' outburst, as dramatic as it was, actually tells us something important about where his head is at. Because people who are confident in their legal position, people who think they're going to win, they don't usually have public meltdowns in court. They stay calm. They trust their lawyers. They let the process play out. But when someone loses it like that, when they start screaming about witch hunts and political persecution, that suggests they're scared. That suggests they know the walls are closing in. Politico talked to several legal analysts after this happened, and the consensus was pretty clear. This outburst is going to hurt Meadows. Maybe not in a legal sense, like the judge probably can't use his behavior as evidence against him, but in terms of public perception, in terms of how seriously people take his immunity claims, this was a disaster. One analyst said, and I'm paraphrasing here, when you're arguing that you were just doing your job as a government official, and then you have a screaming meltdown in court, those two things don't exactly fit together. Government officials are supposed to be calm, professional, measured. They're not supposed to be yelling about witch hunts. And here's another thing that's getting overlooked. This impacts way more than just Mark Meadows. Trump's entire inner circle is watching this. Everyone who worked in that White House, everyone who was involved in the post-election efforts, they're all wondering, am I next? If Meadows can get prosecuted, if his immunity claims don't hold up, then what protection do I have? And on the flip side, prosecutors in other cases are watching this too. They're seeing that they can potentially go after these high-level officials. They're seeing that immunity isn't an automatic get-out-of-jail-free card. So this one courtroom incident, as crazy as it was, is actually setting precedents. It's shaping how future cases will be handled. It's influencing whether other Trump officials will cooperate with investigations or fight them. And let's talk about the political fallout for a second. Republicans are split on how to react to this. Some are saying, see, this proves the whole thing is a witch hunt. They're saying Meadows was right to call it out, that the prosecution is politically motivated, that this is all about taking down Trump by targeting everyone around him. But other Republicans are like quietly distancing themselves, because having your former chief of staff get dragged out of a courtroom isn't exactly a good look. It makes the whole administration look unstable. It reinforces the narrative that these guys were running a chaotic, possibly criminal operation. Democrats obviously are using this as ammunition. They're saying, look, this is what happens when you try to overturn an election. This is what accountability looks like. These people thought they were above the law, and now they're finding out they're not. And moderate voters, the swing voters who decide elections, they're watching this and trying to figure out what to think. Is this justice, or is this political revenge? Is Meadows a criminal who deserves to be prosecuted, or is he a political figure being targeted for doing his job? Those questions don't have easy answers, and that's exactly why this story matters so much. There's also the question of what this means for Trump himself, because Meadows wasn't just any staffer. He was the chief of staff. He was Trump's right-hand guy. If prosecutors can prove that Meadows was involved in criminal activity, and if they can show that Trump knew about it or directed it, that opens up a whole new set of legal issues. Now, Trump has his own legal protections, and there's a big debate about whether a sitting president can even be prosecuted. But the cases against people like Meadows, they're building a record. They're establishing facts. They're creating a paper trail that could potentially be used later. So every time one of these cases moves forward, every time someone like Meadows has a meltdown in court, it adds to this larger narrative about what happened after the 2020 election and who was responsible. And that narrative matters. It matters for history. It matters for how we understand this period of American politics. And it matters for whether similar things could happen again in the future. Okay, so let's break this down into the key points you actually need to understand about what's happening here. Point 1, Mark Meadows is in serious legal trouble, and this outburst might have just made it worse. The immunity defense was already shaky. Legal experts have been saying for months that claiming everything you did as chief of staff was just official duties is a stretch, especially when we're talking about efforts to overturn an election. But it was still a viable legal strategy. Judges were taking it seriously. There was a chance it could work. But when you have a public meltdown in court, that changes things. Not necessarily in a legal sense, but in terms of how you're perceived. Judges are human. They see someone screaming about witch hunts, and that doesn't exactly inspire confidence that this person was acting professionally and within the bounds of their job duties. And beyond the legal impact, this hurts Meadows in the court of public opinion. Because right now, with Trump in his second term, public opinion actually matters. It matters for potential pardons. It matters for potential pardons. It matters for political support. It matters for whether other Republicans will stick by him or throw him under the bus. And getting dragged out of a courtroom, that's not the kind of image that generates sympathy. That's the kind of image that makes people think, wow, this guy must be really guilty if he's reacting like that. Point 2, This is part of a much bigger battle over accountability for Trump's inner circle. Meadows isn't the only one facing prosecution. Multiple former Trump officials are dealing with legal issues and how these cases play out. Whether these people end up convicted or whether they successfully claim immunity, that's going to set the tone for American politics for years. Because here's the thing. If Meadows and others get convicted, that sends a message that you can't use your government position to break the law. It says that being close to the president doesn't make you untouchable. It establishes that there are consequences for trying to overturn election results. But if their immunity claims succeed, that sends a different message. It says that government officials have pretty broad protection to do whatever they think is necessary. It makes it harder to prosecute future officials who might do similar things. And honestly, both outcomes are kind of scary in different ways because we want government officials to be able to do their jobs without fear of being prosecuted for every decision. But we also want to hold people accountable when they cross lines, when they allegedly try to subvert democracy. Finding that balance is like one of the hardest challenges in constitutional law, and we're watching it play out in real time with these Trump-related cases. Point 3, the Republican Party is fracturing over how to handle this. Some Republicans are all in on the witch hunt narrative. They're saying these prosecutions are politically motivated. They're defending Meadows and others. They're arguing that this is all about Democrats trying to criminalize political opposition. But other Republicans are quietly backing away because they know that defending someone who got dragged out of a courtroom isn't a great look. They know that moderate voters, the people who decide elections, might not be sympathetic to the witch hunt argument when they see this kind of behavior. And this split is going to matter going forward because Republicans need unity to be effective. They need to be able to present a coherent message. And when you've got some people saying Meadows is a hero and others saying maybe we should distance ourselves from this, that's not unity, that's chaos. The fracture goes deeper than just this one incident too, because the Republican Party is already dealing with divisions between Trump loyalists and more traditional conservatives, between people who think the 2020 election was stolen and people who want to move on, between those who see these prosecutions as political warfare and those who think, maybe we should let the legal system do its job. And every time something like this happens, every time there's a dramatic courtroom scene or a new indictment or a major legal development, those divisions get worse. The party splits a little bit more, the factions become more entrenched. Point 4, this affects how we think about the 2020 election aftermath. For a lot of people, what happened after the 2020 election is still the defining political issue of our time. It's about whether Trump and his team legitimately challenged what they saw as irregularities or whether they tried to steal an election through pressure and manipulation. In cases like Meadows, they're where we actually litigate those questions, not just in the political sphere, not just in cable news debates, but in actual courts with actual evidence and actual legal standards. So when Meadows has a meltdown in court, when he accuses prosecutors of running a witch hunt, that doesn't exist in a vacuum. That's part of this ongoing national debate about what really happened and how we should respond to it. And different people are going to interpret this incident completely differently based on what they already believe. If you think the election was stolen, then Meadows' outburst looks like righteous anger at a corrupt system. If you think Trump tried to overturn a legitimate election, then this looks like a guilty man panicking as he faces consequences. There's no neutral way to view this story. It's inherently political, inherently polarizing, inherently tied to the biggest divisions in American politics right now. Point 5, this sets a precedent for how high-level officials can behave in court. And honestly, this is something people aren't talking about enough. Because courtroom decorum matters. The justice system only works if people respect it, if they follow the rules, if they accept that there's a process that has to be followed. When someone like Mark Meadows, a former White House chief of staff, starts yelling in court and has to be forcibly removed, that's a breakdown of that system. That's someone saying, essentially, I don't respect this process. I don't accept the legitimacy of these proceedings. And if that becomes normalized, if more and more high-level political figures start acting that way in court, then what? Do we just accept that powerful people don't have to follow the same rules as everyone else? Do we accept that courtrooms are just another political arena where you can grandstand and shout and make a scene? Or do we say no? This is unacceptable. There have to be consequences for this kind of behavior. Those are real questions, and they matter for the future of our justice system. So, where does this go from here? Well, Meadows is still facing multiple legal battles. This courtroom incident doesn't end anything. It just adds another layer of drama to an already complex situation. His immunity claims are still being debated. His potential charges are still pending. The whole legal process is going to continue playing out over months, maybe years. But the bigger question is what this means for accountability in American politics. Are we going to hold powerful people responsible when they allegedly break laws? Or are we going to accept that government officials get special protection that puts them above the law? And honestly, I don't think we have a clear answer to that yet. These Trump-related cases are testing our legal system in ways it hasn't been tested before. We're in uncharted territory. What I do know is that scenes like Mark Meadows getting dragged out of a courtroom, those aren't normal. Those aren't how things are supposed to work in a functioning democracy. Whether you think he's a victim of political persecution or a criminal facing justice, we can probably all agree that having former White House chiefs of staff screaming in federal courtrooms is not great. And the fact that this is happening during Trump's second term, while all these legal battles are still ongoing, while the country is still deeply divided over 2020, that just makes everything more volatile, more unpredictable, more likely to explode into something even bigger. The stakes here are enormous. We're not just talking about one guy's legal problems. We're talking about fundamental questions of power, of accountability, of whether our system can handle situations like this without completely falling apart. And the truth is, we don't know yet. We're living through this in real time. Every court decision, every dramatic outburst, every new development, it's all shaping how this story ends and what it means for the future. So yeah, Mark Meadows lost it in court. Security dragged him out. It was chaotic and unprecedented and totally wild, but that's just the surface. Underneath, this is about power, accountability, and whether anyone in American politics is actually untouchable. And we're going to find out the answer to that question, whether we're ready for it or not. Next time, we're going to talk about what happens if these prosecutions actually succeed, what it means if Trump's inner circle starts going to prison, what that does to the Republican Party, to Trump's second term, to the entire political landscape. Because this story is far from over. Stay tuned.